It's Danny Goki, the comeback on Vision Christian Radio. Neil with you, the Tuesday edition of 2020. A conversation shortly I'll invite you to join into. You might have your own contribution to the sorts of things we'll talk about today. But our special guest helps people make sense of the world and how we might interact with people who don't think like us. We're going to be talking about the Bible, our culture, and the challenging issues we face, both here in Australia and really throughout the entire Western world. Christopher Watkin says it's not enough for Christians to explain the Bible to our Australian culture. We must also explain the culture in which we live. In other words, remaining biblically faithful and becoming culturally sensitive. Christopher Watkin is about to release his latest book. It's called Biblical Critical Theory, in which he exposes and evaluates the often hidden assumptions and concepts that shape today's thinking. He looks at them through the lens of the biblical narrative running from Genesis to Revelation and asking urgent questions like, how does the Bible's storyline help us understand our society, our culture, and ourselves? Associate Professor Christopher Watkin lectures in European languages at Monash University. His research interests, these are interesting, themes of religion, atheism, and the secular in philosophy and literature. Chris, a special welcome along to 2020.
Thank you, Neil. It's great to be here.
Chris, Christians and our culture, remaining biblically faithful, becoming culturally sensitive. I guess a lot of people don't even think about why others think differently to what we might think as a Christian. How do you describe the way people think differently?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it, Neil? I think you're right. Most of us, we just go through life living day to day, don't we? We don't think, how do I view the world? What do I think a human being is? But, the thing is, we've all got answers to those questions. Even if we just assume them, even if we couldn't, say what they are out loud. Because, when you get out of bed in the morning, you've got to do something. You've got to make choices. And the choices that we make reveal the sort of people we think we are and the sort of world we think we live in.
In some sense here, our identity is important because it's who we're identifying or what we're identifying with that often shapes the way we think. How do you describe the shaping process that happens to all of us? And yet, when we talk about being a Christian, we tend to begin to think differently. How do you think about those shaping influences?
I think everything in society around us shapes us, makes us into certain sorts of people with certain sorts of desires and certain sorts of fears. If you think about how many adverts you see in an average day, out in the city, on your phone, on screens all around you, all of those are shaping you. They're all telling you what to look for in life, what the good life is, and what you should desire. And so society is doing an incredibly effective job of shaping us into certain sorts of people. But I guess as Christians, we also want to be shaped by the Bible, by God's word. And when we immerse ourselves in it and think and pray through the Bible, it's doing the same sort of thing. It's teaching us what's important in life, what sort of things we should be looking for to desire and what sort of things we should be fleeing away from in life.
Now, I mentioned in our introduction, you're an academic, you're a lecturer at university, in the Monash University, and you've got some favourite French philosophers, some that are very, secularist, even some of the sorts of things we might even be really concerned about. But you're interpreting those things. Is this something that ordinary people ought to be aware of? Because do you have to go to university to understand the way that people think differently? How do you try and interpret that for, ordinary listeners listening to a conversation today, but they've never been to university, but they want to know why people think differently?
I find Paul's image of the body a really wonderful help with things like this. So his idea is that the Christian church is a body and there's lots of different parts of it and they're not all the same. And so, down in my little academic neck of the woods reading all these French philosophers, you might think of me as a toenail. There I am, part of the body, doing my job. But I'm not the whole body. So not everybody needs to go away and read, people like Derrida and Foucault. Other people in the body do things that academics could never do. And it's working together that we're the body of Christ. So I've got my little thing. I'm a little bit of the body, but there's lots of other bits too.
Let's just squeeze in a thought or two about this other dimension that I mentioned in our introduction. Sometimes as a Christian believer, we say, well, we've got a message. We just got to deliver that and leave it to everyone else to interpret it. But you're saying, in some sense here, we've got to be able to even let people know the sort of culture that they are in. So even helping people understand the way they think that they do so that they can actually receive and appreciate the sorts of things we might talk about from the Bible.
I think you're right, Neil. I think that's the biblical model as well. If you look at the way that Paul goes about trying to speak about Jesus to different people, he speaks really differently to Jews than the way he speaks to pagans who've got no Jewish background at all. He says, I tried to become all things to all people so that I might win some. And he really tries to get under the skin of the cultures that he's speaking to. Think of Acts 17, where he's addressing all those philosophers on Mars Hill, and he talks to them about their own culture as a way to introduce the biblical gospel to them. So I think there's a biblical pattern that we're trying to follow here.
Now, when we're bringing a word from the Bible, even understanding the biblical narrative, as we're going to talk about today, Genesis through Revelation, understanding something of the bigger thinking that God has, sometimes we think that, people who are intelligent and they've got all sorts of degrees and that somehow or other their wisdom is way, way advanced on where I might be, bringing my message in there, even as the Bible says, sometimes looks like foolishness compared to the wise, educated people of our time. Is there something from Scripture we can draw some attention to that gives us some insight into how our message of the gospel actually is very, very powerful?
One of the brilliant things about the gospel, and this really sets it apart, I think, from a lot of the ideologies of our age, is that you don't need to be massively educated to grasp its fullness. Jesus says, let the little children come to me. There's something about receiving a free gift that they understand that adults find it really hard to understand. And so, a 7-year-old who's a Christian is a proper Christian. They're not just, a baby Christian or a halfway Christian. And yet there are depths and riches in the gospel message that even some sort of towering genius like Augustine can seek to plumb the depths of all his life and never get to the bottom of. And that's really unusual. If you look at all the different ideologies and ways of looking at the world, there's usually a bar that you've got to get up to, an intellectual bar to grasp them. It's really not the case with the gospel. And that's one of the delights of being a Christian, that someone with a mental disability, for example, or a person beginning to suffer from memory loss, or a little child can be a full Christian in the full richness of that word. And yet the greatest minds in the history of the world have only just begun to scratch the surface of the wonders of God's wisdom.
So a simple message. There's something profound in this, isn't there? That the message of the gospel, that Christ died, that he rose again, that he has paid the price for our sins. The simple message of the gospel, how we respond to that, linking in our belief with God, that makes a huge difference. And it really is what you're saying here, Chris. Cuts across cultures, cuts across age differences. It really is the universal message that can be understood by everyone.
I think that's right. And I think, again, Paul shows you how this one unchanging, glorious gospel message is preached differently in different cultural contexts, so that the gospel doesn't change, but when he's speaking to a Jewish audience, he uses different images and different background to explain it to when he's speaking to a pagan audience. And so, in our own age, we shouldn't expect, say, sub-Saharan African Christianity to look exactly like Western Christianity. And that's one of the glorious things about the gospel. The unchanging gospel finds its home in every human culture.
And I know you've got a favourite passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I wonder if you can describe just how important, if listeners were going to their Bible right now and they're finding 1 Corinthians chapter 1, what they might discover there about the way we communicate, the way we're perceived, the way we think differently.
If listeners are going to 1 Corinthians 1 at the moment, they should fasten their seatbelts because they're in for a brilliant ride. Paul does something amazing in this passage. You remember that it's the passage where he identifies two major cultural values in the world around him. He says, Jews look for miraculous signs and Greeks seek wisdom. And then he does two things with those values, and it's the combination of the two that's brilliant. First of all, he sets the cross of Christ in opposition to those two values. He says Greeks look for wisdom, but the cross of Christ is foolishness. And he says Jews look for miraculous signs, and what they want is power. They want a manifestation of God's power. But he says the cross is weakness. And if that was all he was doing, you'd think, well, you know, the gospel and the culture are just like oil and water. They never mix. But he doesn't just do that. He goes on a few verses later to say that the foolishness of God in the cross is actually wiser than human wisdom. So he's like comparing the two, and he's saying if you really want wisdom, if you want the fullness, the richness of wisdom, you actually need to go to the cross, because there you're going to find a wisdom, the depth of which that the Greeks searching for their wisdom haven't even begun to comprehend. And so God's foolishness and God's weakness are both the opposite of what people in the world think they're looking for, and actually the fullness of what people in the world are looking for. And the reason that that's so brilliant is that I think we tend to do one of those or the other. So there are some Christians today who say we must show that the gospel is different to the world. We must put clear blue water between the culture and the gospel. And that's like Paul saying God's wisdom is foolishness. You know, they're different. And some Christians say, oh, you know, we've got to get alongside culture and we've got to show how we're relevant. And that's how, like Paul saying, the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. But actually, he shows that we need both of those. The gospel is both the opposite of what the culture is looking for and the deepest, richest fulfillment of what the gospel is looking for. And that's why that's one of my favorite passages. It's just brilliant how he does that.
Well, I'll encourage listeners to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And even while we're talking here, you could be reading that. And as you say, Chris, you know, get blown away by the wonderful, exciting and intentional way that God actually differentiates the wisdom of this world from the wisdom of the cross. It's a little bit like if you think you're an intelligent person, come to the cross, you ain't seen nothing yet. The cross actually, it is the central element of our Christian faith, and really coming to this area of communication of how we actually communicate to people who think differently, the cross actually is very powerful in this area. It cuts across. Now, if you're trying to show how the Bible and its unfolding story help us to make sense of modern life and culture, where do you like to start?
I think that a great place to start is to do a Bible overview. That was where the penny really dropped for me. That was when I began the journey that led to writing this book. So when I was a really young Christian, I sort of had an idea that the Bible was a collection of really important stories, or it might even have been like the history of a nation. But it was only really when I did a Bible overview that I said, oh my goodness, the Bible is, from the first page to the last, one coherent, unfolding story, complex stories, many layers, but it's one story of reality. And it's not just a story within reality, it's the story of reality in which you can live, that makes sense of everything. And it was like walking into a whole new world. We had a little boy. He was about 3 at the time I started writing this. And he would love to bang a pan with a wooden spoon over and over and over again. And it was like going from a world in which that's your picture of music, like, you know, that's the best that music ever gets, to suddenly being given tickets for a symphony orchestra and walking into a concert hall and thinking, oh my goodness, music is so much richer than I'd ever imagined. And it was like the Bible is so much richer than I'd ever thought it was, because it is this one unfolding story. And so I'd begin with doing a Bible overview. There's lots of brilliant Bible overviews out there. Mike Rater down here in Melbourne has got one with Ridley College. If you hop on Nancy Guthrie's website, she's got some brilliant Bible overview material on there. Vaughan Roberts, God's Big Picture. Give yourself a Bible overview. Dive in and have fun.
Well, a way to talk about humanity, the description of humanity, as you say, God has his dealings with humanity, even with the raising up of a nation. And then, of course, with Jesus' arrival, that very first Christmas, the incarnation, and God's plan that he's out working throughout all of the history of the world. That's another dimension for another day, perhaps, but the fact that there is an historic overview that you can take from Genesis through Revelation, this is something that some people don't appreciate about what the Bible gives to us.
And it's so incredibly rich, Neil, isn't it? I don't know how it was for you when you first discovered that the Bible actually sets out this whole vision of the world in the form of a story. But I think it's transformative. It certainly was for me in my own Christian walk. And I guess if any of your listeners haven't done a Bible overview yet, I couldn't recommend it highly enough.
Well, we're going to come back after Vision National News and continue our conversation. You might like to contribute to our conversation. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. You might have a question, you might have a comment, you might even have a critique for our conversation. That's okay too. 1-800-316-316. Christopher Watkin is our guest. He's about to release his latest book. It's called, sounds a little academic, but it's Biblical Critical Theory. And you'll be able to get a hold of that. Simply Google that online. No doubt you'll be able to get it when it is released, because it's just coming up for release. We're back with more after Vision National News. Wonderful to have you with us on this Tuesday edition of 2020, making sense of what's going on, understanding why people think differently. If you're just joining our conversation, it's a fascinating one today, and I do want to invite you to join into our conversation. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Our special guest today says, people make sense of the world. He helps people make sense of the world and how we might interact with those who don't think the way that we do. We'll be talking about the Bible, our culture, and the challenging issues we face here in Australia and throughout the Western world. Christopher Watkin says, it's not enough for Christians to explain the Bible to our Australian culture. We must also explain the culture in which we live. In other words, remaining biblically faithful and becoming culturally sensitive. Christopher Watkin is about to release his latest book. It's called Biblical Critical Theory, in which he exposes and evaluates the often hidden assumptions and concepts that shape today's thinking. And he's looking at them through a lens of the biblical narrative, running from Genesis through Revelation and asking urgent questions like, how does the Bible's storyline help us understand our society, our culture, and ourselves? Associate Professor Christopher Watkin is our guest. Christopher, in this part of our conversation, I wonder if we're talking about those things that are shaping people's thinking, the secular world. What is it, do you think, if you can put your finger on some simple priorities to talk about here, what is it that's shaping people's thinking? Because a lot of people will say all sorts of things look like they've gone haywire. People don't think the way they used to.
I think that's certainly right, isn't it, Neil? Societies keep changing, not just in our own century, but in the past as well. Look, I think if I had to boil it down, I'd say a lot of the ideas that are being used to attack Christians today are actually Christian ideas. Ideas of freedom and emancipation and equality are largely ideas that Christians have introduced into the culture over the centuries. And these are the ideas now that are being used to sort of beat Christians over the head in public. And I think that's a really strange position for Christians to find themselves in. So Christians have been a persecuted minority in the past, in the late Roman world, with Nero burning Christians and in the Colosseum, that sort of thing. But the ideology of Rome was not really influenced by Christianity at all. And then for the longest time, Christians sort of had a dominant position in society. Think of the medieval world, the church was really powerful. And now that power is receding and that dominance is waning away. And Christians, to use Steve McAlpine's phrase, are becoming the bad guys again. But the reason that we're the bad guys now is that Christian ideas are being used to attack Christians. We're against freedom, we're against equality, and those ideas were brought in by Christians. And that's a weird situation for Christians to find themselves in.
So when we talk this issue of freedom, and I know this is a special interest of yours too, the Christian idea of freedom, because as you say, going back to those early centuries, Christians were under the thumb of the Roman Empire. Freedom was not something that Christians had. And things began to develop in such a way that Christianity came into a more sharp contrast with the cruelty of the Roman Empire, and freedom became an issue there. So it became, as a Christian idea, as you say, these things being used against us now. So it really comes down to definitions of the words that we use. And there'd be an awful lot of philosophers who've taken issue with the way we use words, and I think it's Derrida, the philosopher, who really was very much a part of saying that words have meaning as you want them to have meaning, and they're used ultimately in a political way. Any thoughts here about freedom and how these things are being just used against us even more?
Absolutely. So if you ask most people today what freedom means, I guess they'd say something like, it means not to have any constraints on you, to be able to do what you want. If I want to go a certain place or be a certain way, that I'm free to do that. And that's what a philosopher called Isaiah Berlin called negative freedom, freedom from everything, all the things that might hem me in. But it's not, interestingly, it's not the biblical idea of freedom. And the biblical idea of freedom comes from the Exodus, that huge sort of defining story of the Old Testament where Moses leads the people of Israel across the Red Sea and out of slavery in Egypt. And it's really interesting to see how the modern world has picked up the language of the Exodus to talk about its idea of freedom. So Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement in the US in the mid-20th century used this language of Moses, let my people go. And that language has been used over and over again in the modern world. But if you look at that language in Exodus, it's used 7 times in the book of Exodus. And every single time, it's followed by something like, that they may worship me. Let my people go, that they may worship me. And I think that's really hard for the modern world to wrap its head around. Because so the modern world hears, let my people go, and they think, wonderful, freedom from constraint, that's exactly what we want. And then they hear that they may worship me, and they think, oh no, here's Christians being oppressive again. But actually, I think that the Bible hits on something that's true of every sort of freedom here, but that the modern world finds it really, really hard to admit, which is that freedom in one area comes through constraint in another area. And think about it this way. I can't both eat a pizza every day for lunch and dinner and then win the Wimbledon tennis tournament or win the Australian Open. I can do one of those, but if I eat lots of pizza, I'm not going to be fit enough to win the Open. And if I win the Open, then I can't eat lots of pizza. So I can be free to eat pizza, or I can be free to win the Open. But I can't be free to do both. I've got to constrain my appetite for pizza, or I've got to constrain my desire to be a brilliant tennis player. And I can only be free in one of those areas by constraining the other. And that's the way that all freedom works. So I can follow my reason, I can live life reasonably. But if I do that, I've got to park my impulses and desires and emotions once in a while. Or I can let myself be guided by my desires all the time. But if I do that, I've got to park my reason. So I can only be free in one area by constraining another area. And the Bible understands that. But I think the modern world finds it really hard to understand that, because it's got this idea of we should just be free in every way all of the time. And it doesn't work like that.
So as Christians, we appreciate being freed from the shackles of sin. That's what our redemption is all about, isn't it? Breaking free from the shackles. And God has enabled us to do that. But then in our identifying with Christ, aligning ourselves with Him, behaving the way He does, and thinking His thoughts after Him, thinking the way that He does, we are actually then constraining ourselves to be like Him. And so there's this freedom from one thing, as you say, but then there's some constraints in this other area. So the opponents, Chris, if we as Christians are the ones with the true freedom, our opponents then are trying to, in some ways, deal with us in the interests of their own power. How much is power in a part of what the opponents of our freedom might be using against us?
Power is one of those really tricky words, isn't it? It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. If we understand power in some really broad sense, as in like acting on the action of others, influencing others, then I think power is just unavoidable. Like, we're all exercising that all the time. Like, our conversation now going out over the airwaves is inviting people to think in particular ways and act in particular ways. It's sort of offering a particular influence. And, if you switch over to a different radio station, you're being catechized, you're being formed in a particular way of looking at the world. So I think power in that sense is not just something that's in some corners of society and not elsewhere. It's something that's everywhere. And the question, therefore, is not, are you exerting power? It's, what is your power serving? And I guess that the power that Christians have, we're pleading with people to come to a God who loves you, who died for you, who is committed to you to the point of death and beyond, and who has proved that He has your best interests at heart. And don't use your power to try and conform people to, for example, a market society that's a rat race and rewards the successful but beats down the weak. Don't use your power to commend that to people. Or use your power to commend to people an ideology that's going to dehumanize them. So everyone has power, and I think Christians should use their power to commend a God who is for us and who loves us.
As Christians have power, we put our faith in the all-powerful God, and we know that there is power in the one who is created and the one who is, as you've been saying, from Genesis through Revelation. He's fulfilling an historic mandate that He's already put in place. But if you wanted to be the opponent of Christianity, if you wanted to take down Christianity and in so doing take down the West, because we know that as we talk about Western civilization, there are some Christian foundations in there that are undeniable. So if you want to take down the West, you've got to remove the idea of the divine. Now, Chris, you're an expert when it comes to the way that atheists think, the way that those opponents of this Christian view think. If they're wanting to take down the West, removing the idea of the divine, is that the way they are trying to do that? How do you describe it?
It's a really interesting question, Neil. Thank you. I think, first of all, I'd be hesitant to identify Christianity completely with the West. I want to say that taking down the West is different to taking down Christianity. The Bible is a Middle Eastern book. Augustine was a North African. Most of the people who wrote the New Testament were Middle Eastern Jews. So I think that the Bible is bigger than the West. And the West has a lot of problems that are not drawn from the Bible. So I think if we're talking about how people try to take Christianity down or try to take the Bible down, that there are two theories of this. One is that the modern world just gets rid of the divine, that there's no God anymore. The other theory is that the modern world keeps the idea of the divine, it just moves it around. So it's no longer God that's your sort of ultimate transcendent value, but for example, it's money or even sex. And Tim Keller's really good on this in his idea of idolatry. He says that we've still got the divine, it's just been sort of attributed to other things in society. And I find that position really persuasive and really helpful. So it's not that modern people don't have any gods at all. It's that, to use biblical language, that our society's gods are idols, and they don't love you like the biblical God. Money doesn't love you. Sex doesn't love you. Power can't save you. And so we're commending people not to sort of begin believing in a God when they've not been believing in anything, but to turn to the true God from idols that will destroy and dehumanize them, to a God who loves them and will make them more fully human than they can ever imagine.
So money, sex, power, let's add to that even science. For some, that becomes a little like their God as well. And interestingly, we're not just tucked away in a little corner, because as you're indicating here, Chris, shuffled off to the side, moved around. We can move the divine and, we'll take control of God sort of thing. If you're a Christian believer and you want to be able to understand what's happening to you, what's happening to your faith, what's happening to the reputation of your local church, somehow or other you've got to be able to offer a critique, or in your own mind come up with some reasoning as to why these things are happening. So our biblical lens, let's come back to the biblical lens we're looking through. How does that help us to understand all of these things that are now mounting their attack against our Christian values and our faith?
I think Christians have a resource in the biblical story that is unusually acute and insightful in giving a sort of a reading and an insight into the way that society works. And the way in which it's unusually insightful is that Christians believe that reality is a story. And put it its most simple, it's got the moments of creation, where God made the universe, the fall, where Adam and Eve eat the fruit and sin comes into the world, and then redemption, the whole history of the Old Testament leading up to Christ, and then consummation, the new heavens and the new earth. So creation, fall, redemption, consummation. And what that gives to Christians, that it's actually really hard to get if you're not a Christian, is a view of reality where the way things are now is not the way they're meant to be. So I can look out at society as a Christian, and I can see, just in the same way that everyone else sees, that this is not paradise on earth. Things are not perfect. But as a Christian, I can say, I know why that is, because of the fall, because of sin, mine and yours and everyone else's. And I know that it won't always be that way. I know that God has a plan to fix this. And so I can critique society, if you like, contemporary society, from a point of view outside society, because I see that vision of redemption. I see what philosophers have called that standpoint of redemption. And if you don't have that Christian story, it's actually really quite hard to get that standpoint of redemption, because your view of the world is, look, the way things are is just sort of the way they've always been. They change a little bit, but there's nowhere to stand outside the status quo to critique it. But Christians do have that position. And I think that gives us a wonderful perspective to be able to speak into the pain and the suffering of the world as it is now, and to cast a vision for something bigger.
As though if we know the God who is the creator, we can have a God's eye view of what's happening. And so we can say that his view of the way humanity is the reality view of the way humanity is. We actually stand on a much more firm foundation than all the shifting sands that are going on around us. Hey, let's take a call. 1-800-316-316. Duncan is in Norseman in WA. Hello, Duncan. Welcome.
Hello.
Duncan, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are this. I like to think that I live a Christian lifestyle, but I'm not religious. What I take offence to listening to your station, and frankly it's the only station I can get down here, is you use terms like the truth as if it's your right. And no one else can use the word the truth because it's. I mean, look, to me, the truth is my truth. It's what I believe in. But I think, listening to your station, that you throw the word around as if it's the absolute truth.
Yep, throwing the word around as if we own it because we've met the one who says, I am the truth. And so there may be something special in that, but I know that our special guest, Chris, might have a thought or two here for you. Duncan, your thoughts, Chris?
Hi, Duncan. I think it's a really important question. I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I think Christians often do come across, don't we, as really quite arrogant, as saying to everybody else, right, you shut up, listen to me, I've got the truth. And I think when Christians do come over that way, they're misunderstanding the Bible. So God, as Neil was very rightly saying, is the truth. His truth is absolute. And Christians, if you like, should be pointing away from ourselves towards him, saying, don't listen to me. I'm not the sort of final word on truth, but look over there, there's God, he is. And stand shoulder to shoulder with me and listen to what he says. And I think it's also probably worth pointing out that everybody has an angle on truth. So Duncan, yourself, you were saying, I have my truth. And so it's not that Christians are the only people in society saying we think we found the truth. And the question, therefore, is, how does your version of truth, how does my version of truth treat people who don't have that truth? Treat people on the other side of the line. If the people on my side of the line are the ones who I think have the truth. And I think that the thing that Christianity offers to society there is to say that the Christians who have the truth don't have it because we're cleverer or because we're more moral or because we've lived a better life than other people. The only reason that we have the truth is that God has been gracious to us in a way that we didn't deserve. And so Christians have no right at all to look down on people who don't have the Christian truth because they're not less intelligent, they're not necessarily less moral, they're not worse people. And it's only through grace that Christians have the truth. Now, if you believe that the truth is gained, for example, through rationality, then it's very hard not to look down on people on the other side of the line because you are more rational than they are. And so I think Christianity provides a model of truth that gives you no opportunity to look down on people. Yes, sorry.
Duncan, what were you going to say?
Just backtrack a little bit as what you said about 30 seconds ago in regards to looking down at how other people think.
Yep. So you're wanting Chris to reflect on looking down on what other people think, and that was an important issue there around arrogance that you were talking about, Chris. I wonder if you've got a thought for Duncan here, but I know that for every Christian believer who's listening in, interested in the way we actually conduct ourselves in a conversation about truth.
Yeah, I think arrogance is a bit of an epidemic in society, isn't it? You hop on Twitter and everybody seems to be looking down on views that are not their own, usually on the other side of the political spectrum. And so I guess a question facing us all is, how can you hold different views to other people without looking down on them? And I think that Christianity has something to offer to the conversation there, because if you're a Christian, the reason that you have the truth has nothing to do with you. Not because you're clever, it's not because you're moral, it's nothing to do with how good you are in any way. It's simply that God has been kind to you. God has been gracious. And therefore, if as a Christian, you look down in any way on people who don't have the truth, you're betraying the biblical witness. You're pretending that there's something good about you that means that you're worthy of the truth. and other people aren't. And that is not what the Bible says. And so Christianity gives you a model of being able to hold to a truth, to say there is actually a truth, and I found it, but that doesn't mean that I'm better than anyone else, and it doesn't mean that I can look down on anyone else.
But again, you're using the word truth. It's your truth, it's not the truth.
Duncan, if I'll just chime in here, sometimes we talk about biblical truth. We reference Jesus, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So as the Christian believer, we appreciate something special about truth, and that is that it comes from somewhere above what you or I might think about each other's truth. It comes from this transcendence in who God is, above who we are. And there's a certain sense in which I think that transcendence is the powerful thing that we can actually ascribe to, because, as you say, Chris, it's not come from ourselves personally, because we're gracious recipients of that truth. Now, Chris, I'll give you the last word here.
I think Duncan is grappling with something that a lot of people grapple with, and it's a really important thing to weigh up. I think that it's impossible not to have an idea of truth. However, I think that Duncan, for example, you're giving a take on ultimate reality. You're saying that no one should be able to say I have the truth, which is a claim about the way things are that is actually just as definite, just as dogmatic, if you like, as saying that Christians have the truth. It's still making a claim about the way things are that's bigger than any individual.
Duncan, I want to thank you so much. What a great contribution by just sharing your heart there. And I hope that's been a valuable response from our special guest, Christopher Watkin. Duncan in WA, I want to thank you so much for your call. And time really has run out, and I feel like, boy, we would love to talk to another hour. So we might have to make a time in the new year, Christopher, and if you're happy to come back and be a part of another conversation where we can grapple with some of these things, I would welcome that, and I'm sure listeners to our conversation today would welcome that too. As I farewell you, let me just say your new book is coming out. It's called Biblical Critical Theory. And given your academic position, we'll think here that this is going to be a little bit of an academic read. But there are going to be a lot of listeners who are going to say, that's the sort of thing I want. I want something that's going to deal with the questions that people have in a really powerful way. When is the actual launch date for your book, Chris?
I think in Australia it's the 22nd of December. They're desperate to get them in the shops by Christmas. That's what I know.
The book is called Biblical Critical Theory and launched on the 22nd of December. You might be able to pre-order from whatever bookseller that you like to use. There is also a website to draw attention to. It's called thinkingthroughthebible.com. thinkingthroughthebible.com, and it's at that website too. You'll be able to get a message to our special guest today, Associate Professor Christopher Watkin. Christopher, thank you so much for taking some time to share your thoughts and your heart with us today on 2020.
It's been a real joy, Neil. Thank you so much.